Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. The entire history of Canada is upon us. This is history. Hope you're doing well, as I said before. My name is Shields, and today we got to learn us something that we don't know. We've done the history of Canada in a couple formats, but never in this format. I obviously we know that there's a couple of versions of how you would look at the history of Canada, whether it be modern nation state or whether it be the territorial region, which has been occupied by First Nations for the longest time. Let's see what we got. Usually we have a combination of the two. Let go.
Nation on the Canada, the second largest nation on the planet.
Yes, by land area.
Comprising some 3.8 million square miles and spanning 6 time zones, Canada's territory is so vast that it encompasses numerous climates, from the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains and the flat expanses of the prairies, to the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest and the frozen tundras of the Arctic Circle. However, this diversity is not limited to its geography. It is also reflected in its people. Over the course of centuries and millennia, Canada has been shaped by individuals from all over the world, bringing with them a wide range of cultures, languages, and religions. Although these differences sometimes led to conflict, they more often fostered mutual understanding and cooperation, as diverse communities came together to build new identities in an entirely new nation. So, how did this country develop? From the arrival of First Nations peoples thousands of years ago to becoming one of the most multicultural and diverse places on Earth today. This is the history of Canada.
Let's go.
The story of human
Oh, we got the bearing straight.
habitation in Canada, like that of the entirety of the Americas, begins with the movement of people across the Beringia land bridge that once connected eastern Siberia to western North America around 16,000 years ago.
And some of that is even like, that's like a conservative estimation. Some people even believe this is like 20 something thousand years ago.
For the following millennia, this land bridge gradually disappeared as global sea levels rose with the melting of the glaciers that had once covered much of the Earth's surface during the last ice age, around 11,000 years ago, thereby permanently cutting off North America from Asia. The retreat of the ice sheets allowed these early humans to move southward and begin to populate the land that would one day become Canada.
Now, just imagine, as we take a step back here, wonder how these people just saw this opportunity as the ice melted, the climates warmed, they became more and more ingrained in the land, which is Canada and North and the United States today, just because of the opportunity of the climate.
Over the subsequent generations, Indigenous peoples began to form complex societies and speak a variety of First Nations languages, which varied from region to region. Much of the eastern portion of the country became home to the Algonquian and Iroquoian peoples, who ranged all the way from Hudson Bay in the north to the Atlantic seaboard of the modern United States in the south. On the central Great Plains emerged the closely related Cree-speaking peoples, who tended to migrate from place to place as nomads, following the vast herds of bison that roamed across the prairies. The western portion of the country was home to the Nadene and Salesian-speaking peoples, whose livelihood was sustained by the abundant salmon stocks of the region, as well as the great cedar trees, which they used for building homes, canoes, and totem poles.
It's really interesting that sorry, let me get a better, clear picture of
Cedar
this.
trees, which they used for building.
It's always so interesting to see the totem poles and the art, and a lot of it's probably rooted in religion, right? Don't know too much about it, but that's my assumption.
Homes, canoes, and totem poles. Meanwhile, in the frozen far north of the
Is it Inuit? Inuit? Is that what we call the top?
country emerged the distinct Inuit people,
That's right.
who ranged across the Arctic archipelago all the way from Alaska to Greenland. Unlike the rest of the Americas, however, which dates the discovery of the continent by Europeans to the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492, Canada is unique in that it predates this event by almost 500 years.
Yeah, and the first Europeans obviously are coming from by way of, is it either Denmark or Norway, and then by way of one of the British Isles, right? And then of course by Iceland, by Greenland, and then this of course is Leif Erikson and the Vikings landing. I forget where they land. If it was in Nova Scotia.
Sometime during the early 11th century, the Vikings, who had already explored and settled in Iceland and parts of Greenland, began to venture further westward toward the coast of North America. Leif Erikson is now considered to have been the first European to set foot on the continent, parts of which he named Helluland and Markland, most likely corresponding to what is now Baffin Island and the coast of Labrador.
Okay.
Erikson continued to explore the coastline further south and went on to establish the first known European settlement in the whole of the Americas, possibly at the site of what is now Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland.
Newfoundland, okay.
The Vikings named this area Vinland, and the settlement itself served as a base of operations for further exploratory voyages up and down the coast, where at some point the first contact between Europeans and Native Americans, whom the Vikings called Skraelings, was made.
Skraelings?
The immense distance between the Norse colonies in North America and their Scandinavian homelands meant that communication was often a long, slow, drawn-out process. However, if you've ever found yourself abroad, the Norse presence in North America would ultimately be a short-lived one, for their settlement at Lanceau Meadows appears to have been deliberately abandoned by the 12th century.
How do we know it was deliberately abandoned?
This was followed by the gradual withdrawal from their other settlements in Greenland over the succeeding generations. Awareness of the North American continent's existence subsequently faded from European knowledge with the departure of the Vikings, and it would only become known again some 500 years later. In 1497, just 5 years after the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus's discovery of the Caribbean and Central America, another Italian explorer named Giovanni Caboto, better known as John Cabot, who was in the employ of the English crown, became the first European since the Norse to once again lay eyes on the coast of North America. Subsequent voyages to the region were made by English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese explorers during the early 16th century.
Right, every single nation that could do it basically did it, not even counting the Dutch, which would be probably a little bit south of where they're going. But yeah, I mean, this was like an arms race, but it was more or less like it was a discovery race.
Despite these powers laying competing claims to the territory in one form or another, none of these claims were backed by permanent settlements or colonies. It was only in 1534 that the French explorer Jacques Cartier made a foray into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and claimed the territory on behalf of France, naming it after the local Native American word for settlement, Kanata.
Really?
Naming it after the local Native American word for settlement.
The Native American word, which Native American word? Like Algonquin or Iroquois? But Algonquin, my bad. Kanata. That's interesting, the etymology.
Kanata. His two subsequent voyages to the region saw him venture further down the St. Lawrence River and construct the first French settlements. Although all of these ended in failure, his efforts nevertheless put Canada on the map as a prospective and potentially lucrative colony. By the turn of the 17th century, only a handful of determined European fishermen and fur traders continued to frequent Canada's shores. However, in 1603, the Frenchman Samuel de Champlain began undertaking a series of expeditions to explore and map the territory in greater detail. He identified sites for permanent French settlements, establishing Port Royal in Nova Scotia in 1605, as well as founding the city of Quebec in 1608.
It's so interesting that they're able to map such distinct areas without any cartographical, things that we have today, as well as understand the change of terrain here to there, especially in the distance. These are hundreds and hundreds of miles apart. Very impressive.
which would later become the capital of the entire territory of New France. Champlain also explored deep into the interior of Canada, becoming the first known European to lay eyes on the Great Lakes and
Of course, one of his lakes, Lake Champlain.
to establish relations with the First Nations peoples of the region. As a result of his efforts, a slow but steady trickle of immigrants began to arrive in New France's colonial settlements, which by the mid-17th century amounted
And this right here is showing strictly women because, and you can see the men taking off their hats because I forget who at the time. When was this? 1500s. I don't know who it would be, but basically they imported women specifically for population incentive.
to a population of little over 3,000 people. However, the French were not the only Europeans to have established settlements by this time. The English, led by Humphrey Gilbert, had claimed sovereignty over St. John's in Newfoundland back in 1583. This was followed almost a century later, in 1670, by the establishment of the Hudson's Bay Company, which operated a series of fur trading posts and forts across an immense swathe of northern Canada, known as Rupert's Land. This was designed to compete with the French fur traders further to the south. So much so that by the beginning of the 18th century, what is now Canada and the United States had effectively been divided into two European spheres of influence, one French, encompassing the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and extending down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico, and the other British, which controlled the area around Hudson Bay.
So basically like a European sandwich here. So you obviously have you have that really trekking the Mississippi River, even though you can't really tell it here. But you have the Mississippi River all the way from Louisiana and the Port of New Orleans all the way up through some of the lakes, and then from all the way to Quebec. So you have very much a river dwelling colony of New France, and you have really a sea dwelling society of England, with, of course, that makes perfect sense when you think about the British Empire, especially. The interesting part, I guess, is Rupert's Land when it comes to like Hudson Bay up there, in terms of that vast Hudson Bay territory of possible whaling, fishing, and other things.
As well as practically the entire eastern seaboard of the North American continent, stretching all the way from Georgia to Newfoundland. As a result of the competing colonial interests between the two powers, conflict over territory and resources was almost inevitable. From the late 17th to the mid-18th century, several wars between the French and British broke out, which saw the boundaries and possessions of their respective North American empires shift back and forth. It was only with the outbreak of the French and Indian War in 1754 that the most significant and lasting territorial change in Canada's history would take place.
Of course, that's George Washington there. This is the 7 Years' War, also the French and Indian War in North America.
This regional conflict was part of the wider 7 Years' War, which was fought around the world and pitted a host of European powers, including France and Britain, along with their overseas colonies, against one another. In North America, this played out as a struggle between the colony of New France and the British 13 colonies, along with their Canadian provinces. Despite gaining the upper hand early in the war, the French gradually began to lose ground. First in Nova Scotia, where the French-speaking population, known as Acadians, was expelled by the British, and then in 1759 came the decisive blow when the heart of New France itself, Quebec, fell to British forces following the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Other French towns and cities in Canada fell to the British the following year, and by the war's end in 1763, France, having been roundly defeated, formally renounced all claims to territory in mainland North America.
Really? Well, what rebolstered them to the Louisiana Territory? Because I cannot remember.
Canada then passed into British rule, which began with attempts to repair relations with the various Native American peoples of the region, many of whom had been forced to take sides in the previous conflict. The British also reinstated most of the property, religious, political, and social customs of the French-speaking population in the Quebec region.
Yeah, and to this day, French Canadians. That entire region, Francois, is the dominating language. English is the second language.
allowing them to retain their language and legal traditions, many of which remain in place to this day. However, despite the British government's best efforts to consolidate their territorial gains across North America, trouble was already brewing. Not in their Canadian colonies, but in the American ones. Grievances over taxation and political representation eventually escalated to the point where the American 13 colonies rebelled and began a revolutionary war to rid themselves of British rule. Although some in Canada sympathized with the American revolutionaries, most remained loyal to Britain and supported the war effort. This attracted an invasion, albeit an unsuccessful one, of Quebec by the American Continental Army in 1775. For the remainder,
I mean, it was successful for a little bit, but then, but then the British Navy arrived, and then it got squashed and kind of resulted back towards the 13 colonies itself.
of the war, Canada served as a secure base of operations for British troops to conduct their campaigns to the south. The war was finally brought to an end in 1783, with the newly independent United States of America emerging victorious and establishing its borders with what then became the remainder of British North America. These borders were largely built upon the pre-existing outline of the former 13 colonies and were bounded by the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, the Mississippi River, and the 45th and 49th parallels. In that same year, the British also began evacuating their troops from New York City, along with many American loyalists who did not wish to remain in the United States. Many were transported to Canada, where they formed new communities in Nova Scotia, and helped to establish the entirely new colony of New Brunswick. Some were also settled in Quebec, which in 1791 was divided into the largely French-speaking Lower Canada and the English-speaking Upper Canada, with its capital at York, modern-day Toronto.
Interesting. Why is it Lower Canada and Upper Canada? Is it similar to like how the Nile is Lower Nile, Upper Nile in terms of Egypt, Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt?
Founded in 1796. Meanwhile, far to the west on the Pacific coast, efforts were underway to bring this region, what would later become part of Canada, under British rule. Although the Spanish were the first European power to explore the region in the mid-1770s, they failed to back up their claims with any lasting settlement. It ultimately fell to the British to assert a lasting influence in the Pacific Northwest, beginning with Captain James Cook, who visited Vancouver Island in 1778 as part of his voyage across the Pacific. He established relations with the First Nations tribes of the region and purchased several sea otter pelts from them, which he later sold in China for immense profit.
Wow.
Thus initiating what
Lucrative.
became known as the China trade across the Pacific Ocean. Although there was a brief moment of crisis in 1789 between Britain and Spain over their competing claims in the region, the British ultimately secured a favourable and peaceful resolution. As a result, during the 1790s, further efforts were made to open up the Pacific Northwest to British fur traders. Not only were more maritime expeditions sent to explore the region, such as that of George Vancouver, who
Oh, wonder where his name will suit that island, and then of course one of the biggest cities in Canada.
arrived in 1792, but overland missions were also undertaken. Figures
And this is very disputed territory, the Northwest Territory, which is also known as the Oregon Territory. And there's like continuous back and forth here all throughout the 19th century.
such as Sir Alexander Mackenzie pioneered previously uncharted routes through the Rocky Mountains to reach the Pacific Ocean, which then allowed for the establishment of the first settlements in what would become the territories of Vancouver Island and British Columbia. However, the competing commercial interests of British and American fur traders would lead to the region becoming heavily disputed between the two powers for the decades that followed. With the turn of the 19th century, however, peace between Britain and the United States had begun to show signs of strain. Not only were there territorial disputes as America began its expansion westward,
By the way, that map isn't 100% accurate here. It's more like a bleed between blue and red, because it's kind of a shared origin.
but its trade with Napoleonic France, whom Britain was at war with, caused considerable resentment within the British government in London. As a result, trade restrictions were placed on American ships, and the Royal Navy took to press-ganging American sailors on the grounds that they were British deserters. By the year 1812, the Americans had had enough and decided to launch an invasion across their northern border into British Canada.
Not a really smart decision.
The War of 1812 lasted for the better part of 3 years and was characterized by a series of back and forth invasions by both American and British Canadian forces into each other's territory, ultimately without significant result. When the war ended,
Didn't mention, but they burned the White House down.
the border between Canada and the United States remained more or less unchanged, with neither side having made any meaningful gains. To repair relations between the two nations, it was agreed to demilitarize the border between the US and Canada, an arrangement that remains in effect to this day, with the boundary between the two countries being the longest undefended border in the world.
I mean, there's border patrol. That's about it.
Despite the normalization of relations between the North American neighbors, some in Canada, particularly loyalists and colonial elites, continued to harbor deep anti-American sentiments. This had dramatic consequences some 20 years later, when growing frustration over undemocratic colonial rule inspired some Canadians, partly influenced by American Republican ideals, to turn to armed revolt.
It seems like that little red beanie, red cap, is like the de facto revolutionary hat.
The rebellions of 1837 to 1838 saw widespread disturbances across both Upper and Lower Canada, prompting a strong response from government forces who brutally suppressed the uprisings. In the aftermath, a report commissioned by Lord Durham blamed the rebellions on the lack of democratic governance in the region and strongly recommended enacting a form of responsible government in Canada, allowing the people greater say in how they were ruled. Shortly afterwards, in 1840, both Upper and Lower Canada were merged into a single colony, the United Province of Canada.
And that's where it begins.
Which set the country on the path towards becoming a self-governing nation. By the mid-19th century, Canada had begun to expand into the geographical shape that we recognize today. The disputed territory between Britain and the United States in the Pacific Northwest had been resolved with the Oregon Treaty in 1846. However, Canada as a whole was not yet a unified political entity, remaining instead a patchwork of separate colonies. During the 1860s, discussions began about uniting these colonies into a single confederation.
McDonald in this photo? I think that's him sitting, right?
And on the 1st of July 1867, the Dominion of Canada was formed as a fully self-governing polity within the British Empire, with Ottawa as its capital. Over the course of the 1870s, the remaining colonies and territories of British North America joined the Dominion. Yet, although the country was now politically united, some within its borders did not wish to be part of the newly formed nation.
The First Nation people?
Amongst the flat expanse of the Canadian prairies lived the Métis, a mixed-race people of joint First Nations and European descent, who fiercely opposed any incursion by Canadian settlers from the east onto the land they had occupied for generations. As a result, a series of violent confrontations occurred between them and government forces, first in the Red River Rebellion of 1869, and later in the Northwest Rebellion of 1885, led by Louis Riel. The Canadian government eventually prevailed and used its victory as impetus to complete the Canadian Pacific Railway, the construction of which had begun in the mid-1870s. This allowed the government to consolidate control over the vast territory it was now responsible for governing. The last spike was driven in on the 7th of November 1885, and the first transcontinental railway journey across the country was completed in the summer of the following year.
And that, just like many other states, a transcontinental railroad, where we're talking like the United States did it, obviously you got the Trans-Siberian Railroad that's completed much later in the 20th century, but you have so many different like versions of this. It just creates a unity. It creates a centralized society of economic activity. It creates a equal playing field too for the economic activity. But of course, it comes at the expense of the peoples that lived there in the First Nations. And I'm sure there was a lot of other use cases that deny the sovereignty of those people. And not saying Canada's the only one that did that. Everyone did that.
The remaining decades of the 19th century saw further Canadian expansion, as the government negotiated treaties with the resident First Nations peoples in a bid to open up more territory for settlement. Many reserves were created for the exclusive use of Indigenous peoples, although some were forcibly removed from their land. The government also launched assimilationist programs, such as the residential school system,
Yeah, that's not a really shining spot either.
aimed at extinguishing native languages and cultures
It's a form of genocide. It's a form of genocide.
among Indigenous children and integrating them into Canadian society. The late 1890s also saw the discovery of gold in the Klondike region of the Yukon Territory, in the far north of the country,
So obviously this is a gold rush. Oh my god, there's a lot of people here.
attracting some 100,000 prospectors. Although few would strike it rich, the influx of activity and development in the region nevertheless helped formalize the last boundary dispute between Canada and the US state of Alaska. With the dawn of the 20th century, Canada had become a well-developed and prosperous nation, attracting a growing number of migrants in search of a better life. Although it had established self-governance over domestic affairs, it remained a part of the British Empire, and was consequently drawn into the First World War, which broke out in 1914. Canada contributed immensely to the war effort, not only by providing a lifeline of continuous supplies to Britain across the Atlantic, but also by mobilizing hundreds of thousands of troops, who served predominantly on the Western Front, fighting in major engagements such as the Somme, Vimy Ridge, and Passchendaele. Support for Britain during the war helped to cement a strong, pro-Anglophone Canadian identity. By contrast,
Of course, they're under the Commonwealth of the Crown.
however, it alienated many French Canadians who protested vehemently against military conscription between 1917 and 1918.
And that's very interesting given that the French Canadians have such a validity of lineage to France, which is more than any place where the war was fought, as you mentioned, the Somme and so forth. But it's interesting that the French Canadians, I guess it's just more or less the optics of the anglicized subjugation that they were within, more than the war itself.
The interwar years brought mixed fortunes for Canada. While the country developed socially, with the establishment of ice hockey as the national sport through the formation of the National Hockey League, and made political progress, most notably by granting women the right to vote, it also suffered economically due to the effects of the Great Depression during the 1930s. Despite this setback, Canada gained greater political autonomy with the passing of the Statute of Westminster in 1931, which, along with similar measures for other dominions of the British Empire, set Canada on the path towards full independence in later decades. Progress towards this goal was temporarily halted, however, following the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. Canada once again answered the call to arms from Britain, replicating its earlier efforts by supplying
Yeah, it's just an interesting dynamic there between we live here, why do we need to fight your war, but we're still sort of attached at the hip.
men and material for the war effort. This time, however, Canada also faced direct attacks in its territorial waters. where
Really?
German U-boats sank a considerable number of Canadian and Allied ships. Despite the height
Where at? You're like, are we talking about like 50 miles, 50 nautical miles, or 200 nautical miles off their coast?
threat, Canada was designated as a potential bastion for the British government and the wider empire in the event
And that's insane. So that means if Great Britain falls,
that Britain itself was overrun by a full-scale German invasion.
wow,
Between 1939 and 1940,
that would have been insane. That's so interesting to me. I didn't really think about that. So like in a version where Germany takes over Great Britain, obviously there's a formidable ocean between the two. Canada might become New London, at least for a little bit.
Operation Fish was carried out, relocating a portion of Britain's gold reserves and financial assets,
Whoa, I didn't know that.
amounting to some $56 billion in today's money, to Canada for safekeeping, marking the largest transfer of wealth
Such a risk too. You must have had some escorts on that one, right? Because U-boats are just not good. Not good to mess around with.
in history. Similarly, the Coates mission was drafted by the British military,
Of course, that's Elizabeth, that's George, and then Queen Consort right there.
outlining plans to evacuate the royal family to Canada should the British Isles fall to the Axis powers.
They said no.
The post-war years saw progress and prosperity return to Canada. Not only did it begin implementing a welfare state, with the introduction of universal healthcare and old age pensions, but it also welcomed the last remnant of British colonial North America into the Confederation, with Newfoundland joining Canada as its 10th province in 1949. The arrival of the 1950s saw Canada become more geopolitically entwined with the United States as the Cold War intensified. Canada became a founding member of NATO and co-founded the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, with the United States to provide joint aerospace defense and ensure the air sovereignty of the continent. The remaining years of the 20th century witnessed Canada's transformation into the nation
A referendum?
we recognize today. Although there were periods of political disruption, particularly with the rise of the Quebec independence movement during the 1960s,
They got very close.
and the referenda held on the issue, the country ultimately remained united. As a symbol of this unity, the maple leaf flag was adopted as the national emblem in 1965. More significantly, the Constitution Act of 1982 was enacted, formally severing the final legal ties to Britain and granting Canada full legislative independence. However, the country retained its connection to the British monarchy, with the reigning monarch remaining as Canada's ceremonial head of state. Today, Canada stands as a diverse and democratic nation that has been shaped by centuries of conflict, compromise, and gradual self-determination. Since the days of the arrival of the First Nations peoples, Canada has been forged by waves of migration from people all over the world, coming together to create a strong national identity that is rooted in resilience, respect, and common understanding of people's differences.
Wow. What a video. Amazing. We spent a lot of time pre-1900 on this video, which is very warranted. Understand the origins of some of this. And I think a lot of things that we could definitely revisit is the 19th century, but specifically, and like really what went down for the unification, especially like during those times of those troubled times, and even as far as up to the referendum and kind of like how that geopolitics like mesh themselves. We saw like a 40% vote say yes to that. And then of course you have the First Nations, you have the Northwest Territory, but there's just so much history that's just overlooked because you have the United States right here. So you have Canada's kind of like little brother in the North American sphere of influence. Very sovereign, especially with their clipping of Great Britain subjugation, even though they still have like a monarchical, like ceremonial role that they're within. It's called the Commonwealth. But yeah, a lot more to come with this interesting, fun nation of Canada. Leave me some video suggestions down below. I would specifically warrant video suggestions that have to do with Canada because it'd be great to kind of like understand things that are maybe not as well known. Appreciate you guys as always. Thank you so much for being here. Until next time, peace out and bye-bye.